As a political analyst, I spend a lot of time reading about what is happening in the world. I spend a lot of time watching political channels and videos, and I especially like reading the comments. And whenever I watch videos on geopolitics, like those regarding the European Union, I always see a few different comments saying things like the EU is a totalitarian state, the EU is like Nazi Germany, the EU is a dictatorship, etc., etc. So I wanted to go over some details regarding the EU and try to make a conclusion on whether it is indeed an authoritarian state, or is it just being called authoritarian by people who don't like the EU's policies. I tried coming at this from an unbiased standpoint, primarily because I didn't know much about the EU to begin with. But I will say up front that the size of government and amount of government corruption are directly proportional. The larger the government, the more government corruption and abuse of authority you will have. So during my research, I came across some interesting tidbits that need to be addressed, and not many people know much about these particular topics. I have to preface this by saying the beginning of the video is kind of boring, but I urge you to continue onward and watch the whole thing. The reason why the beginning is boring is because we have to understand the history of the EU and the way it is set up as its own form of government. But first, let's make sure we are all on the same page. So what does authoritarianism mean? The dictionary definition for authoritarianism says, quote, 1. Favoring complete obedience or subjection to authority as opposed to individual freedom. 2. Of or relating to a government or political system, principle, or practice in which individual freedom is held as completely subordinate to the power or authority of the state, centered either in one person or a small group that is not constitutionally accountable to the people. And 3. Exercising complete or almost complete control over the will of another or of others. To me, an authoritarian government is a government that doesn't represent the people. Its leaders are not elected using the democratic process, but rather they are placed in positions of power by the state. An authoritarian government goes against the will of the people, especially when that will contradicts what the government deems important. An authoritarian state doesn't allow those in positions of power to be removed by the people. Those people are, in essence, protected in their position of authority. So that is how I view an authoritarian state. So can the EU be categorized this way? What policies has the EU adopted that could be considered authoritarian? Does the EU have to abide by the will of the people? Does it have complete control over policy decisions? What exactly can and can't the EU do? These are questions that I will try to answer in this video. Now, a little backstory. Although technically the EU formed in 1993 following the Maastricht Treaty, its origins go back to the 1950s with the Schuman Declaration. The Schuman Declaration was a statement by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman with the sole objective of placing French and German production of coal and steel under one common high authority. This was the beginning of cooperation between European countries. As time progressed, more European nations began to conglomerate and share their resources, removing their independence and declaring their allegiance to the high command authority. The European coal and steel community then began to unite European countries economically and politically in order to secure lasting peace. The 6 founding countries are Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In the 1960s, European affiliation started implementing new policies to help the European people. These include dropping custom duties when trading with each other, as well as agreeing to joint control over the production of food with the sole intent of making sure everybody gets fed. More time progressed, with more countries joining the European alliance, such as Denmark, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and the UK. In 1986, the Single European Act became law. This was a treaty which provided the basis for a program with the goal of sorting out problems with the free flow of trade across EU borders and to create a single market. In essence, The independent European nations are becoming one large single country with a single economy. In 1993, the single market envisioned under the Single European Act comes to fruition and declares the four freedoms of the EU: movement of goods, services, people, and money. Beginning in the 2000s, the expansion of the EU led to many Europeans adopting the euro as their new form of currency. The attack on 9/11 further incentivized the EU to begin working with each other to fight terrorism and crime. A dozen more countries entered the EU between 2004 and 2008. Then, following the collapse of the financial market in 2008, the EU ratifies the Treaty of Lisbon, providing the EU with institutions and more efficient working methods. Soon after the financial collapse, the EU establishes the Banking Union with the sole purpose of ensuring safer and more reliable banking. The EU is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, and Croatia becomes the 28th member in 2013. After the annexation of Crimea by Russia, the EU creates a new security policy by adopting restrictive measures against Russia. The policies include restrictions on diplomatic measures, individual restrictive measures such as the freezing of assets and travel bans, restrictions on economic relations with Crimea and Sevastopol, economic sanctions, and restrictions on economic cooperation. Some specific measures against Russia included the canceling of the EU summit, freezing assets of 155 people and 38 entities, including blocking their ability to travel, creating an import ban on goods from Crimea, prohibiting tourism in Crimea, creating an export ban for certain goods and technologies, and creating restrictions on trade and investment related to certain economic sectors and infrastructure projects. There is much more that can be delineated, but we will stop there. So what have we learned so far? It appears, based on the information we gathered, that the purpose of the EU was to help out all those who reside in Europe. An egalitarian would view this conglomeration as beneficial for all Europeans. But I think there is also a theme to the history of the EU, a theme that many of you may have picked up on during my historical disquisition. And that is that the EU has been expanding rapidly over the decades, not just in its member nations, but in its political power as well. It went from an alliance of European nations to its own form of government, where it can impose sanctions on other countries, create travel bans, provide security, and create policy that affects every member nation. In essence, the EU is no longer an alliance of independent European countries, but a government that has independent European countries in it, though the term independent may be questionable. The implementation of the European Banking Union creates a common currency which usurps the independence of its member states. The EU has control over the monetary policy of its members. Now, some of you will say that that's all well and good, but nothing you have said so far is authoritarian. It's not unusual for nations to create alliances and trade with each other. Sure, the EU appears to be its own nation rather than a hodgepodge of nations, but nothing you have said is considered very radical. My retort to that would be that the more time progresses, the more the EU will be its own nation, which will allow it to affect millions of people, more so than it does now. And we haven't even gotten to some of the EU's controversial authoritarian policies, nor how it has been consolidating power over the last 40 years. Now let's briefly discuss the structure of the European Union. Then we will go over some of its policies that have and will affect millions of people. Then we will recap everything, and I will give you my final analysis on what I perceive the EU to be and whether I believe it is a good or a bad player for European independence. Finally, I will pose the final questions to you. Do you think the EU is an authoritarian state? Do you think the EU has too much power? Do you think member nations should leave the EU just like Great Britain voted to do? And what should the future of the EU be? According to the 1992 Treaty on the European Union, also known as the Maastricht Treaty, which we mentioned earlier, the main institutions that administer the European Union are the European Parliament, the European Council, the Legislative Council, the European Commission, and the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the Court of Auditors. The European Parliament, along with the Council, deals with legislation. Notice how I didn't say creates legislation. In fact, the Parliament has no control over what laws are introduced. The Parliament consists of 751 members, with no country allowed to have over 96 members. The Parliament elects its own Commission president and officers from within itself. The European Council consists of the heads of state or government member states and the President of the Commission. Its main function is to define policy of the Union. The European Commission acts as a civil service function of the EU. It executes the budget and other management functions. In essence, it is the big boss. The EU Court of Justice consists of a number of different courts with judges appointed by member states and is responsible for mediation between the EU and national parliaments. The European Central Bank is just as it sounds, the Central Bank of Europe. Its operations synonymous with central banks all over the world, which is to control governments. The Court of Auditors is an external investigative audit agency. These institutions make up the framework of the European Union. So now we have a history of the European Union, as well as its main institutions and the functions they do. But are there any aspects that would lead anyone to believe the EU has authoritarian tendencies? Well, here are some things I found that made me shocked, to say the least. No state has a right to veto EU legislation. Whatever the EU says goes. The European Parliament cannot make its own laws. That job title falls under the European Commission, which just so happens to be unelected bureaucrats who cannot be removed. No national parliament is sovereign. This means they can only exercise legislative authority to the degree permitted by the EU. When there is a disagreement between a member state and the EU, the European Court of Justice steps in to mediate. They rule, more often than not, in favor of the EU over the nation state. The foreign, security, and defense policies of European member states are coordinated by the EU's High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. This is a high-ranking position where the leader is elected by the European Council and not by the people. The Treaty of Lisbon, as mentioned earlier, forces the EU to expand its power. They do this by targeting poor countries and offering lots of money from the taxpayers of different nations for infrastructure and other projects for the poor country, re-educating nations to facilitate accession into the EU and adopt EU laws. Once an independent state becomes a member of the EU, it can no longer be allowed to negotiate trade deals with countries outside the EU. That prerogative is strictly delegated to the EU government. The EU invites lobbying from multinational groups and establishes committees to decide what is best for corporations, the EU government, and its agencies. The EU also allows multinational corporations to sue national governments for passing legislation that damages their profits. And the EU mandates that Great Britain, a nation surrounded by water, can only catch 20% of the fish in British waters. Yes, you heard that correctly. Now, let's discuss some controversial EU policies that are extremely similar to the neo-Marxist/globalist agenda. The Barcelona Declaration occurred in 1995 with the sole purpose of increasing the amount of Islamic migrants entering the EU from Mediterranean, non-EU member nations. The reason for the declaration and the massive influx of Islamic migrants was, at its surface, to help with trade negotiations with countries in the Middle East. The declaration also states it will defend the rights and liberties of Muslims who enter the EU, which is a fancy way of saying they will ban anything that could be construed as Islamophobia, especially with regards to the amount of crime the migrants bring with them. Furthermore, the EU ignores the will of the people to this regard, as poll after poll shows the majority of Europeans do not want to accept Islamic migrants into their country. This declaration is considered by many to be the basis for accepting the rampant amount of Islamic refugees Europe has received in recent years. Without the Barcelona Declaration, the basis for this massive acceptance would not be valid, and it would have been harder for the EU to have a reasonable argument for accepting the migrants, other than the argument we hear on the mainstream sources, that it is the humane and egalitarian thing to do, or, which is even funnier, is that its impact will be beneficial to the Union as a whole. On a side note, I don't see how importing massive amounts of uneducated foreign refugees who don't share a common language with the countries they are coming to can be beneficial to the Union as a whole. That's just me. But apparently, the livelihood of foreign citizens take precedent over the livelihood of European citizens, just like many believe the livelihood of illegal immigrants take precedent over the livelihood of American citizens in the United States. A very flawed yet very common argument. Some conspiracy theorists say that this was all planned out, that the motive for rampant migration is to foment unchecked multiculturalism and mass migration, leading to the inevitable control that the government will need to implement in order to accurately sustain all the residents in Europe. And though I won't admit I believe in that theory, I will say, however, that it wouldn't be the first time the global elites created a malevolent plan for the purpose of more global power. The Marrakesh Declaration is a recent example of where the EU lies in terms of their commitments to their people. It is very similar to the Barcelona Declaration, where once again the EU refuses to do what's best for the citizens of its member nations, and instead do what's best for citizens of other countries not affiliated with Europe. But instead of massively increasing the amount of immigrants from Mediterranean countries, the Marrakesh Declaration increases immigration from Africa. The nation of Hungary opposed this declaration, and now they are being attacked by globalists as being a country predicated upon bigotry. All you have to do is watch the BBC interview of Hungary's foreign minister Peter, whose last name I won't even try to attempt, to get a clear understanding of the amount of persecution being directed their way. For those who haven't seen the interview, I highly recommend you check it out. The BBC's reporter's neo-Marxist agenda gets exposed to the world to see. All you have to do is take a look at the like to dislike ratio and notice that comments are disabled to get an accurate assessment of what the public thinks of this so-called BBC reporter and her regressive agenda. The neo-Marxist agenda is synonymous with the globalist agenda. They are one and the same. To destroy the sovereignty of a nation by displacing the nation's citizens with foreign citizens. This is not a critique on immigration, but a critique on mass immigration and a critique on the neo-Marxist globalist agenda. The inevitable question always follows: when does mass migration go too far? How many European citizens have to suffer before the realization comes that if you cannot properly take care of your own citizens, you shouldn't try to take care of other countries' citizens? But this ever-growing thought is being attacked every single day now. The amounts of racial slurs directed at those who oppose mass migration are becoming more robust every single day. Cries of racism, xenophobia, bigotry, fascism, and all other hypocritical epithets are being pronounced by those who advocate for mass migration. If you are not with us, you are against us. The Bush Doctrine is back, but with a whole new groove. There are 5 people in the European Union that are said to be the masters of everything the EU gets involved in. They are Mario Draghi, the unelected president of the European Central Bank; Jean-Claude Juncker, the unelected president of the European Commission; Jeroen Dijsselbloem, the unelected Brussels commissar and president of the Eurogroup; Donald Tusk, the unelected president of the Euro Summit; and Martin Schulz, the unelected president of the European Parliament. These 5 people have the utmost authority in dictating policy for the European Union. They are either ignorant of what is happening in Europe, or they know about it and are allowing it to happen for some type of nefarious, ulterior motive. For example, under the command of the 5 masters, there have been numerous asset and property bubbles, banking crises, and large-scale unemployment in all peripheral countries. This includes over 20% youth unemployment rate in Portugal, over 42% youth unemployment in Greece, and over 33% youth unemployment in Spain. So what do the masters think is the best way to combat this? Well, according to them, they need more power in their hands. Or, as Angela Merkel said, we need more Europe. What she is referring to is completely removing the sovereignty of independent nations and forming the EU into one gigantic country, which is exactly what we discussed earlier, and this appears to be the end goal for the five masters and leading European figures. Since the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, the EU's main objective is to remove all national borders and conjoin all European nations into one centralized European government with centralized European monetary policy, centralized European fiscal policy, centralized European foreign policy, and centralized European regulations, including trade negotiations and diplomacy with countries not in the EU. The dissolution of Europe is happening right in front of everyone's eyes, and they are too ignorant to see it. This ignorance is not their fault, however, but the fault of the five masters and all of those working with the globalists in the European Union. They are purposefully keeping European citizens in the dark while they slowly destroy independent nations and force them under the control of one centralized dictatorship. And of course, we all know about the recent censorship happening in Europe. And although this cannot be solely based on EU policy, it can be based on the current political atmosphere happening in Europe. We all remember the case of Count Dankula, who was charged with suspicion of posting offensive material online. The very first question that came to my mind over this was, when did it become a crime to offend someone? When did it become a crime to hurt someone's feelings? Can't supporters of these types of censorship policies see where this inevitably leads to? It is 1984 all over again, where the thought police oppress those who have an independent thought or idea. The danger in this is that no matter what you do, someone will always be offended. There will always be someone who takes things the wrong way, someone who takes a joke personally. And when you create laws to prevent those from getting their feelings hurt, you open up a can of worms that inevitably leads to censorship of thought, speech, and the removal of all other civil rights and liberties. We all remember when Brittany Pettibone and Lawrence Southern were detained and prevented from entering the UK strictly due to their ideology. Having right-wing political proclivities is now enough to prevent you from entering a country. Again, can't supporters of this see where this is going? Can't this exact same thing happen to them? Are they really going to let their hatred for those who disagree with them cloud their judgment, resulting in their personal liberties being forcefully removed? When you prevent someone from speaking freely and prevent someone from entering a country strictly because of their ideology, then you are truly acting in an authoritarian manner, and all rights go out the window. And of course, we all know about Tommy Robinson, a right-wing political activist jailed for, quote, contempt of court, when we all know it was because of his ideology and the questions he was asking. Once more, state censorship on full display. And one final example to mention, and believe me, there are many, many more. Do we all remember the stories of German and Swedish journalists prevented from reporting on news stories regarding the amount of crime being committed in Germany and Sweden by Islamic refugees? There have been numerous scandals covering this very incident, that journalists are being prevented from reporting on the truth. Once more, censorship in action. So in conclusion, my research indicates that the EU is not a full totalitarian state, but it's pretty damn close. I don't see the EU as a fully functional authoritarian state, but rather, I see the EU as a state with strong authoritarian tendencies that has implemented numerous authoritarian policies. Now, some may say that it's just semantics and nitpicking, and they could be right to some degree. But when I think of authoritarianism, I imagine a government completely isolated from the people. The EU is not quite there yet. If I had to quantify the percent of authoritarianism in the EU, I would probably place it at about 80% authoritarianism and 20% democratic. but that's just an arbitrary number based on my research. It's really hard to actually state how much of an authoritarian state the EU is, but my belief is it is definitely more authoritarian than democratic. The EU has conducted lots of totalitarian and authoritarian actions, but it still has many functions that abide by the democratic system. For now, anyway. In my opinion, the EU is becoming more authoritarian every day, but it is not authoritarian in every sense of the word at this point in time. In another 10 years, who knows? But then again, in another 10 years, Europe may not even exist anymore. And that is not an embellishment, but an observation based on current trends. What's important to note is that the structure of the EU removes the independence of its member nations. What may be good for Germany may not be good for Croatia. And as the EU increases in size, as well as authority to implement certain policies, those member states lose even more of their independence. So to recap, I think the EU will damage its member countries by slowly wilting away their right to act in their own self-interest and instead force them to adopt measures the majority wants at the expense of the minority. We are seeing this happening more and more, especially since the Lisbon Treaty was passed in 2007. And those countries that fight back against the EU's tyranny will immediately be ostracized and labeled as fascist. Immigration is now the de facto aggregate used by globalists to determine whether a country or whether citizens of that country are comprised of bigotry. Not bigotry based on personal inherent racism to a particular group, but because those citizens want to do what's best for their family and their countrymen over what's best for foreign invaders. A country should be allowed to do what's best for their citizens, and if a country chooses to do something the leaders of the EU don't want, then that country should not be subjected to punishment and regulations. This is especially true with regards to immigration. The European refugee crisis has brought with it crime not seen for years, and because of this, countries in the EU should have the right to stop this crime by stopping the immigration that is bringing the crime, regardless if this action of closed borders violates one of the EU's founding principles, the freedom for people to travel whenever, wherever. The EU is a quasi-empire that is slowly transforming disparate nations into one big conglomeration. And with this conglomeration, the right of a nation to do what's best for their own people is ignored via majority rule. Not majority rule of the people, but majority rule of members in the European Union. I don't see the EU as an authoritarian state, but I do see the EU as a state with authoritarian tendencies, and those tendencies are leading it to a destination that opens the door to complete control over its member nations and the people those nations oversee. One more thing I need to reiterate, and that is that the EU is infamous for keeping their citizens in the dark regarding many of their policies. I mentioned this earlier, but it's important to really stress it. How many of you have heard of the Barcelona Declaration, the Marrakesh Declaration, the 5 de facto unelected leaders of the Union? These are things that Europeans should know, and yet many Europeans are ignorant of these controversial decisions. It appears that the EU likes it that way. They like keeping their citizens in the dark about what they are doing. I believe the EU needs more transparency, lots more transparency. The citizens of Europe should know what is going on in their homelands. They should know what their leaders are up to. But sadly, many of them are kept in the dark due to the lack of transparency the EU utilizes. And those who do discover the dark secrets of the EU have to do so by researching these incidents from websites that the globalists target as racist, fascistic, and xenophobic sources of knowledge. They are trying to control the news by denigrating anyone that questions the status quo. They use labels such as Nazi and bigot to prevent normal people from really looking into what is going on. So what do you think? Do you think the EU is a totalitarian regime? Or do you agree with me that it has authoritarian tendencies and is on the road to full totalitarianism? Do you think it is a force for good? Or do you think it is destroying the sovereignty that independent European nations possess? I support the abdication of member states from the EU. I support Brexit, and I feel other nations should do the same before they lose what little freedom they have left. But there is a silver lining. As more and more people wake up to the reality of their situation, the more people will completely remove themselves from globalist tyranny. We are already seeing it with populist uprisings all over the world. The people are fighting back against their masters. The only question is, will these populist uprisings bring about much needed change for the betterment of all, or will they devolve into their own form of authoritarianism? After all, power breeds corruption, and history has taught us that not all servants differ from their masters in how they choose to rule. If you like what you see here, please share the video and consider subscribing and being a patron. The Piper Report is an alternative news source that reports on news you won't hear from the corporate media, and the special links to my patrons. And I'm done.